Hey guys, welcome to the latest episode of the 4040 Vision podcast, the ultimate sports history pod where hindsight is 4040. Before we get started, let's pay some bills and hear from our presenting sponsors. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 4040 Vision podcast. I'm your host, Khaled Abdallah, and I'm joined by my fellow co-host, Sulman Haque. What's up, man? How's it going?
Yo, what's going on, man?
Not much. I see you wearing your Trey Area shirt.
Hey, man, bought it by mistake, but still got a rocket, right? Paid money for it.
Who knows? Who knows? He still might be the quarterback of the future. Anyway,
Who
had
knows?
to get that little ding in. So today's episode is about fantasy football. So we're going to be talking about the biggest busts in fantasy football from 2015 to 2020. So we're going to do that based on average draft position, and average auction price relative to actual performance. So I think it's pretty straightforward. So you can see that, some of the guys probably coming off career years, all pro years, people spend a bunch of money, draft them in the top of the first round, second round, whatever it is, and then they fall flat. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. So Sulman is going to pick one. I'll pick one for the year. So it's a total of 12 players, obviously, in the 6 years that we're talking about here. So I'll go ahead and let Sulman go first. Who you got for 2015?
I went ahead and took here Eddie Lacy. I think he was being drafted in the top five in snake drafts, going for around like $58, $60 in auction drafts where you have a $200 auction budget. And, it was with good reason, right? He was coming off an 1,100 rushing yard season, had 9 touchdowns, had 42 receptions, was, had 400 plus yards receiving and 4 receiving touchdowns. So pretty good year he was coming off of. And, everyone was like, oh, this is it. Eddie Lacy, he's the workhorse back in this Green Bay offense. We love this guy. He's gonna be one of the best fantasy football running backs of all time. He was going ahead of like Jamal Charles, Des Bryant, those type of guys. And what ended up with Eddie Lacy in 2015, he was pretty disappointing. He barely reached 750 yards rushing, only had 5 touchdowns, and in that same season, he was demoted to RB2, sat behind James Starks, and that was pretty much the end of Eddie Lacy's career. Actually, like we don't hear from Eddie Lacy after this.
Was this the year where there was the picture of him in training camp where he looked really overweight? Is that the same year?
I can't remember if that. I don't know if this was the same year. I think that was the next year.
Okay. Yeah, which I guess makes sense that
Yeah.
it would be the end of his career. I mean, I remember he struggled. He came on the scene. I mean, he was amazing at Alabama. He looked like he was going to be a franchise type running back in Green Bay, obviously. And then he struggled with weight. I think he had some mental health issues too. So it wasn't like an injuries thing. He just didn't play very well, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was his probably inability to lose that weight, be in good football condition. A lot of that was and when you struggle with that kind of stuff, then I'm sure some mental health issues come above that as well. But
Yeah.
he killed many fantasy football teams in 2015 though.
I'm sure people calling him like Cheeseburger Eddie and making fun of his weight and all that. I mean, a lot of athletes struggle with it. So I sympathize.
Absolutely.
I'm sure it's hard for some guys, harder for some guys than others. So my pick for 2015 was Andrew Luck. So I know it's a little harder with quarterbacks because they're not taken usually in the top 5, top 10, unless you're Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen. But he was taken 18th overall, his average draft position. People spent around $38 on him, again, in that $200 budget. That's the last time I'm going to say that. We don't need to keep repeating it. Luck was coming off. He had an incredible season in 2014. He had 4,700 yards, 40 touchdowns, and rushed for 4 more touchdowns. So just an incredible statistical output. He was quarterback 2 behind Aaron Rodgers and was 14th in total points. But 2015 came around, and people obviously expected more of the same. But I think they had some offensive line issues, and he started getting really beat up. And he ends up playing only 7 games due to a lacerated kidney and a partially torn abdominal muscle. So it's a pretty crazy injury. Obviously, he finishes the season completely unranked as a quarterback in the overall. And this is probably the first injury that led to him retiring early. I can't imagine this was a pleasure to deal with, a lacerated kidney and some of the other stuff. But yeah, so he totally flamed out, unfortunately, due to injury.
Yeah. I remember Andrew Luck. you could count on him until the injuries started, and then the injuries started piling up on the poor guy. And with that horrendous Colts offensive line, and I think what he played like 9 years in the league, and then he retired, something like that.
Maybe less than
Barely,
that. I
barely hit
think
nine. I think
he
maybe
came
less than that,
back.
right?
Yeah, maybe less than that. He came back after this year, and then he missed the whole season with a shoulder injury, and then it was a whole thing.
That's right.
But yeah,
Yeah.
so we'll move on to 2016. Who was your pick for 2016?
In 2016, I went with Todd Gurley. He was being drafted here around pick number 6, $50 on the auction budget. This was his second year in the league, coming off a great rookie year the year before, 1,100 rushing yards and 10 touchdowns. Expectations were sky high for Todd Gurley, but I think the Rams had one of the worst offensive lines in the league that year. He couldn't live up to this hype in year 2, and he barely managed to hit 885 rushing yards, only gives you 6 touchdowns. And so, he's being drafted as a top 10 player and as high as like RB3, RB4, and he finishes as RB15. So, really disappointing if you took Todd Gurley in 2016 in the first round, whereas he's probably a third round, fourth round pick, given his production.
Yeah, I think some of that probably had to do with a lack of offensive creativity, right? This was still Jeff Fisher. I think John or Jeff Fossil took over after that, but it's still the Jeff Fisher era, and they were awful. I think they were like 4-10 or 4-12, something like that year. So that was Jared Goff's first year too, I want to say. Even if
Yep, I
not,
think that's
yeah.
right. I think that's Goff's first year.
So yeah, even if not, I mean, yeah, it was Goff's first year, so it makes sense that they would struggle with a rookie quarterback and stuff like that. So he would go on to be first team All Pro the next couple of years. So he bounced back and then bounced down again after that with
Yeah.
his arthritis and all that. But yeah, so it was
Yep.
just not really injury, just lack of performance. So my pick for 2016 was Brandon Marshall. So in 2015, he was lights out. It was his first season with the Jets. He had 1,500 yards, over 100 catches, 14 touchdowns. He got his first Pro Bowl nod, and he was second team All Pro. And he got to play the whole season with Ryan Fitzpatrick at when he was still pretty young. And he finishes the year as wide receiver 3. The next season, people spend the 13th overall pick usually, so that's top of the second round if you're in a 12-teamer. They spend around $39, $40 on him, and he really just comes back to earth in 2016. He is a lot less productive. He has a bit of a quarterback carousel. He gets Geno Smith for a game, Bryce Petty for 4 or 5 games, Fitzpatrick for 10, 11 games. Obviously, that's not going to be great. And then he had some sort of locker room controversy or fight with Sheldon Richardson, who's probably not a guy you want to fight. He ended up playing all 15 games, and he finished the season with under 800 receiving yards, only 3 touchdowns, and he went from wide receiver 3 all the way to wide receiver 52. And this was kind of the beginning of the end for Brandon Marshall.
Yikes! Yeah, that's a big drop off there.
Yeah.
Wide receiver 3 to wide receiver 52. Oh man, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember Brendan Marshall, right? Like he was like when he was on the Broncos, he was just killing it, even on the Dolphins to an extent, and then he gets here to the Jets, and that's the beginning of the end for him. Apparently the Jets are where wide receivers go to die sometimes.
You know what? That's not far off, unfortunately. I mean, it's not obviously, I mean, we're not like saying anything groundbreaking that the wide receiver is a very dependent position, but if you go from, a steady quarterback situation to a very unsteady one, then it's makes sense that you're going to run into some of these productivity issues and stuff like that. But I mean, I think after that was basically, the end of him as a elite receiver. So it may have been just him kind of starting to fall off physically. He only played till he was 34, and then, he didn't have anywhere near 700, 800 yards after that. So I guess it was just, like I said, the beginning of the end for him. We'll move on to 2017. Another wide receiver. Who you got here?
Yeah, I took Jordy Nelson here. He was going as high as 11 here in drafts, around $39, $40 in auction drafts, and so Jordy Nelson coming off a pretty good season, but 2017 is where his struggles start, and again, as we see, once a wide receiver starts to struggle, apparently that's kind of the beginning of the end for them here. He finishes 2017 with 53 catches, 482 yards, and 6 touchdowns over 15 games. And, a year ago, he had played 16 games, had 97 passes, 1,200 yards, and 14 touchdowns. So, he caught 44 fewer passes, 775 fewer yards, and 8 fewer touchdowns that year. A lot of that had to do with Aaron Rodgers getting hurt but even in the 5 games he played with Rodgers, he was on pace for about only 800 receiving yards. So it was clearly the beginning of the end here for Jordy Nelson. And I think, the next year or the 2 years later, he ends up a Raider. It doesn't have great years. So it's pretty hard. So he's someone you're drafting as someone who could be wide receiver 5, top 12 fantasy guy, and he finishes as wide receiver 50, and just behind the likes of guys like Josh Doctson and Will Fuller, who only played 10 games that season. So that's the kind of year Jordy Nelson has in 2017. Pretty terrible, and it's pretty close to the end of his career as well there.
Yeah, I'd say it's like 60-40, him being old and him not having Rodgers. I mean, we've seen Rodgers can make anybody look like a star, or a lot of guys look like a star. And unfortunately, I think he played only, like you said, 7 games that year. You get a combination like Brett Hundley, and I forget who the other guy was. So it's
really bad quarterbacks.
Yeah. So again, a wide receiver is a very dependent position, and without the right quarterback, you're just going to struggle. But like you said, it was actually the following year where he goes to Oakland. He plays 15 games and he barely scratches 800 yards. I know it wasn't a great year for the Raiders in 18. I think they were like 4-12 or something. This was right after they hired John Gruden. They traded away Khalil Mack and traded away Amari Cooper. So I think he was asked to do a lot more than he probably thought he was going to have to do, and he got a lot more defensive attention than expected. But yeah, it was definitely the beginning of the end in that 2017 season. For me, I went with a running back. So it's Jay Ajayi, who in 2017 was on the Dolphins and the Philadelphia Eagles, which of course had something to do with his struggles. He was picked average around 14th, and teams or fantasy owners spent around $37 on him. So that's pretty high for a running back who's not like in the top, 2 or 3. He was lights out in 2016. It was his first year as a full-time starter after the Dolphins traded away, I want to say it was Lamar Miller. Takes over the job, rushes for almost 1,300 yards, 8 touchdowns. He has another 30 catches, which obviously is a big deal in a PPR or half PPR league. 150 yards receiving, not bad. Gets a Pro Bowl nod, and he's running back 11. And you're thinking, all right, the sky's the limit. He's a young guy. It's his 3rd year. He's entering his prime. Instead, he gets traded to the Eagles maybe a month into the season, and he ends up sharing carries with LeGarrette Blount, which I'm sure was great for him on a personal level because he ends up winning a Super Bowl that year as the backup running back in Philly. But he puts up only 800 yards and 2 touchdowns and ends the season at running back 33. So, again, great for his personal life and his trophy cabinet, but that's about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was weird. I don't know why Miami just kind of was like, "Hey, we're kind of done with this guy." Like a year later, and they're just like, "We're gonna ship him out. We're done with him." That was the weirdest thing about it. So that he performed so well for them, and then a year later, they're just kind of like, forget this guy."
I mean, we already know like running backs are treated like they're disposable in the NFL, and I'm sure Miami at this time, I think they were not doing so well, if I'm remembering correctly. This was early Ryan
Yeah, I think you're right.
Tannehill. So they were probably like, let's
Yeah.
just get an asset for this guy who we don't think is going to be a long-term starter. And they ended up being right. I mean, he didn't have much of a career after that Philadelphia Super Bowl. So he won that Super Bowl, but he didn't win anybody any fantasy Super Bowls. I'll tell you that. So who you got in?
He did not.
Who you got in 2018?
Yeah, in 2018, I got Dalvin Cook here. So he was going around pick 15, around $38, $40 in auction drafts. And so obviously early round 2 guy, and was consistently being drafted around RB10, but he finishes 2018 as RB30. Pretty disappointing season for him in 2018, which is a shocker given he had really good seasons after this. I think part of that is injury because he only plays 10 games. He rushes for only 615 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, has only 300 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Overall, it's not a good season for him, and so where he was being drafted in the second rounds, you expect a lot more. Obviously, some injury concerns, but he surprisingly bounces back the next year, puts up RB top one of the top RB seasons in fantasy, and has a great year the next few years, and then again he declines again. So it's very
Mhm.
interesting where you have like these running backs that kind of have one year of where they're just like not good, and then they just kind of bounce back from that, and then they put up great seasons, and then you see the decline again a few years later.
Where was the hype coming from? I mean, this was his second year. I think he only had like 200 yards the year before. Only played like 3, 4 games. He's a second round pick. So, do you remember where the hype came from coming into 2018 and
I,
why he
I,
was
I think
so
it
highly
was
drafted?
yeah I think people were hyping him just because he was. I think this is this the year the Vikings get Kirk Cousins, or this is before Kirk
Yeah,
Cousins
that
took
was
over.
Kirk Cousins' first year
Just
was 20
first year, yeah.
2018. Yeah.
I think people are kind of hyping it up that oh, he's clearly the starting running back in Minnesota. They have Kirk Cousins. They have the top wide receiver, so he's gonna get a chance to kind of shine in this offense. Is
Hmm.
is where that hype was coming from, and I think just being that starting running back and showing some potential. And it's very interesting because now the same thing's kind of going on with his brother James Cook here in Buffalo. So it's a very interesting parallels.
He's a really interesting case in general. I mean, you wouldn't think that a guy like him would be begging for a job, essentially. But this is obviously the state of the modern NFL running back, and now he gets like a golden opportunity in New York to ball out with Aaron Rodgers and that whole the complement of weapons they have on offense there. So if you're I don't know where you would draft him this year, but I think he's one of the few guys on the list that's like still active. So I mean, what do you think? It was like
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy.
his potential this year.
I
Is
mean,
he back to being 1,000 yard back? Or not back
no
to? He
way,
just
no
did it
way.
last year.
Yeah, I don't think he gets that opportunity per se in New York. He's gonna definitely be splitting carries with Brees Hall. I think that's the biggest concern, right? So you don't take this guy on this like in later rounds, like maybe round 6 or something like that. You try to buy in cheap on Dalvin Cook and hope he exceeds expectations, but definitely no longer the workhorse back,
Hmm.
and that's probably the reason why Minnesota let him go, right? Because he's no longer a workhorse type of guy, and he's injury prone. So
Yeah, maybe he starts off hot as they're bringing Brees Hall along a little slowly, and then he fades down the end of the season. But yeah, he's a
yeah,
really
I think
interesting
that's exactly
case.
what happens.
One of the better
Absolutely.
players recently. Really interesting case. So my pick for 2018 was Rob Gronkowski. So Gronk was coming off an All Pro season in 2017, where he had 70 catches, 1,100 yards, 8 touchdowns, clear cut tight end number one, putting up Travis Kelsey wide receiver type numbers. The next year, I think this is pretty clear because he retired the year after that, or his first retirement was the year after that. He barely had 700 yards, 3 touchdowns in only 13 games. Leading up to this offseason, they tried to trade him to Detroit, and he vetoed it. I didn't know he had a no trade clause, but he vetoed that move. He ends up skipping minicamp. Obviously, his head and all that, his heart's not really in it. They end up winning the Super Bowl anyway because they're the Patriots. That's just what they do. And he played pretty well in a pretty boring, low scoring Super Bowl, but he was one of the key players, obviously, for the Patriots. But in terms of fantasy, he doesn't live up to his average draft position around 21, which is pretty high for a tight end, and the $31 that folks spent on him. And if you remember the season, he was moving really, really slowly, and he looked like Frankenstein at this point, basically.
Yeah, I definitely remember that. I'm like, wow, this guy doesn't look like he wants to. It was either he didn't want to play for the Patriots at that time, or he was just done with football. A lot of injuries. That I mean, Gronk is probably one of the most injured tight ends that's ever played the game. He's always got something going on. So I think maybe it was just both those things. He was just kind of done with football. Too many injuries taking its toll on him, and then took a year off, came back, and got back with his boy Brady and won another Super Bowl in Tampa Bay. So
So it worked
it's
out. I mean, he wasn't
worked out for him.
wasn't a fantasy star after the 2017 season, but he made the plays when it counted. But yeah, I think it was like a combination of what you said, like just being beat up, not wanting to play for the Patriots, and dealing with all that, the pressure and all that came with it. And I'm sure it's hard playing for Bill Belichick. He's a hard ass, so it makes sense, especially for a guy like Gronk. It makes sense for him to want to take a year off. So, who you got for 2019?
Yeah, 2019, I went David Johnson. He was being drafted here around the eighth overall pick, around $45 here in the auction drafts. And so, he was a guy being treated as a top 10 player, probably around RB7, RB8. It was a guy you kind of count on, right? David Johnson, you're like, plug this guy in, he's going to give me numbers. But 2019 was unfortunately one of the worst possible fantasy seasons he could ever have. He rushed for only 345 yards in 13 games and had only 2 touchdowns. Adds about 370 receiving yards and 4 receiving touchdowns. He would finish the season as RB 37. And again, kind of the beginning of the end for another player who I think a year later is out of the league after the season. So he struggles this year, and then it just downhill from there for David Johnson, and we never hear of him again.
This was Kyler Murray's first year. They
Yep.
won, I think, 5 or 6 games, so they were a pretty bad team. It makes sense that he would struggle offensively, and he was not out of the league the next year. But essentially, I mean, he still played another 3 years after this, technically.
Oh, did he play three?
Because
Okay,
remember,
technically, but
yeah,
he
he
went to the
wasn't
Texans, right?
exactly. He was not the star that he was once upon a time, and he fell off really fast. And this was the
Really
beginning of that
fast.
end. He gets traded somehow. He's part of the DeAndre Hopkins trade for some reason. They fleeced Houston, I think. And yeah, he's in Houston for 2 very unmemorable years. He's not really a starter anymore. And then he plays in New Orleans last year for, let's see, 5 games, 12 carries, 24 yards. So,
Did he
yeah,
really? Wow. Okay, I totally don't remember him being on New Orleans. I
I don't
remember
blame
Texans.
you.
I don't remember New Orleans at all. So
It was a tough year last year for this. I think they started like they brought back Mark Ingram. They had Latavius Murray at some point. There was just like a revolving door at running back, so they were bringing in just about anybody, and obviously it did not go well for them. And yeah, he's I mean he's only 31, which I guess is pretty old for running back, but yeah, he fell off very very quickly. So my pick for 2019 is Juju Smith Schuster. So in 2018, he had an incredible statistical season. He had 111 catches for 1,400 yards and 7 touchdowns. He ends the season as wide receiver 9, and he was the 22nd highest overall scorer in fantasy. He was being picked 13th overall, and guys spent around $50 on him in the auction draft. Some of that I think was an anomaly because Ben Roethlisberger had like 5,200 yards or something that year. In 2018, they were one of the worst like rushing offenses in the history of the NFL. All they did was throw the ball, and obviously someone's going to benefit from that, and it was him and Antonio Brown. But then the following year, so 2019, the Steelers trade away Antonio Brown. Juju Smith becomes the number 1 receiver, and it's supposed to be another breakout year, but then they have a bunch of quarterback issues, and Ben Roethlisberger only plays 2 games. He gets 6 games of Duck Hodges and 8 games of Mason Rudolph. So it's understandable that he would struggle. It's not really his fault. He played the whole season, but he only ended up with around 500 yards and 3 touchdowns. He kind of bounced back the following year when Ben Roethlisberger came back, but he was pretty washed at this point. And he had an okay season last year with the Chiefs, around 900 yards. And I think that the 2018 season is more the anomaly. I think he's not a 110, 1,500 yards guy. He's more like he might get a ton of catches, but he's more of like a 700 to 900 yards a year guy. He's more of a possession guy. And now he's in New England with Mac Jones. So good luck with that.
yeah, don't draft this guy. I think that's the problem, right? A lot of people are still chasing that 2018 season. They're like, oh, he did it, he can do it, he has it in him, and that's where you get trapped, right? Especially in fantasy when you're just chasing the past. You gotta kind of look at his current situation and see what's going on with him now.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
Mac
he was
Jones is not the situation you want, right? So
mhm. He was like another guy that's active, obviously, because it's only a couple years ago. But he was a nice plug and play type guy last year. He could have some games here and there, but he's not tearing it up by any means. And I think the expectation was that he would, obviously, because he's playing with Patrick Mahomes. But yeah, he has. Let me see. He has 933 yards and only 3 touchdowns. I think was the bigger thing, and I think that was
Yep,
the expectation. Was he's a big body receiver. He's not a deep threat type guy, but you would think that in a Chiefs offense like that, he would get some red zone touches. But he again was just more of a possession guy. Uh,
exactly.
and
Yep.
but yeah, how I wonder how he feels. He goes from Ben Roethlisberger to Patrick Mahomes to Mac Jones. That's a
I
pretty
mean, he made the choice. He signed there in free agency, so
true. True.
he
I
had
think
a
he
choice.
could have went to Baltimore if I remember correctly, but I guess
Yeah, he had a lot. He had a few options, but he for some reason chose the Patriots. Who knows?
it's the Patriots way, man. I don't know. Maybe it's hard to turn him down sometimes. Uh, and then let's go for our final picks for the 2020 season. So who you got here?
Yeah, I got Clyde Edwards Hilaire. He was being drafted around pick 6, pick 7 in the first round here. $40 there in auction drafts, and it's a pretty unprofounded hype for this guy. He's a rookie with high hopes. The Chiefs just won the Super Bowl. They drafted him in the first end of the first round. Everyone's like, "Oh, this is the guy. This is the guy the Chiefs were missing, right? He's going to be the high powered running back there, right?" And people are widely expecting him to be RB8, RB10. In the 13 games he plays, he gives you 800 yards, 4 touchdowns. He has almost 300 receiving yards and 1 receiving touchdown. And so it ends up being a pretty disappointing season for him. He finishes as RB22, and he never kind of bounces back. Like you never see him go past that. Actually, yeah, it actually gets worse for him the next few years down the line, and to the point where he's not even a starting running back anymore for the Chiefs. So it's a tough go, and it's hard to predict the hype around these rookie running backs. It's hard to predict how NFL teams are going to treat these running backs, and he's just a prime example of why you should avoid rookie running backs in fantasy drafts unless you're doing dynasty or keeper leagues. But don't take them high. Don't take these
Yeah,
guys high.
I think Dalvin Cook probably would have been your best dynasty pick after that bust of a year because he has like 1,500 yards the next couple seasons.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
He
I
becomes a steal.
I mean I remember them drafting him at the end of the first round. This was them coming off the Super Bowl win, and it seemed like, or maybe this was the year after they lost to the Patriots, but it felt there's some hubris in the pick, right? It's like, we're the Chiefs, we have everything, and we're going to draft a running back in the first round, which is just teams just don't really do that anymore. I guess it's more forgivable at the end of the first round versus the top. So he looked pretty good in LSU, and then you think about the offense that he was playing in. He's playing with Joe Burrow. He has two superstar receivers, Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase, like up there. He's got a pretty good tight end. So he's playing in like a historic offense. So obviously he's going to have a lot of space. He's going to put up numbers, but doesn't live up to that. And now he's got his job taken by a 7th rounder in Isaiah Pacheco. So it's hard to predict. And I think the Chiefs running back situation in general has been pretty dicey. Aside from him, it seemed like there was always a different guy starting back there. Was like Damian Williams? Is it Pacheco? Is it whatever? And they don't run the ball enough, I think, to have like a running back one, because even like Jerick McKinnon was getting those screen passes and he was putting up points, but it was so hit or miss that it wasn't
Exactly. Yeah.
reliable enough. So maybe it's like
Yeah.
they used to say don't draft Patriots running backs, but maybe now it's don't draft Chiefs running backs, but for
Yeah.
completely different reasons.
Just don't draft anyone who's a Chief if their name's not Patrick Mahomes or Travis Kelsey. Just don't do that.
Maybe Justin Ross. Are you going to take a flyer on Justin Ross this year?
He's already hurt.
Is it?
He hurt himself already.
Maybe Kadarius Toney, but yeah, he's hurt too. So I don't know who
He's
you
already,
draft.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Don't, yeah, I mean,
I'm gonna have to
maybe
look at
Sky
their
Moore,
depth
maybe
chart.
Rashi Rice, maybe that's it. Like, you don't know. And you still don't know what you're going to get out with those guys. So,
Sky Moore, yeah, maybe that guy. He looks like a running back, and he's got a running back number. So I disapprove of him as a
yeah,
wide
yeah,
receiver.
this is since they started changing numbers, man, it's the most confusing stuff ever for fantasy purposes. You're like, like when you're watching it, you're like, oh, is this a running back? Is this a wide receiver? And you're like, oh, so
Well, now you've got guys wearing like number 0 running around,
yeah,
which
it's
I think
fantastic. It's fantastic.
it looks pretty cool sometimes. I just My beef
Depends on
is
the player.
with,
Depends on the player.
yeah, definitely depends on the player. I just don't think defensive linemen should be allowed to wear single digits. I think that's my
Yeah,
only beef.
that's just weird. That's just weird. Yeah,
If you're
offensive lineman
wearing,
and defensive lineman, you got to wear double digits.
yeah, if you're wearing like a 2X and above in your jersey, like you got to wear two digits, bro. It just does, it just looks weird. I'm not a fan.
You got to
Um,
wear a number above 50 if you're on the line.
so my pick for the 2020 season was Michael Thomas, so a wide receiver for the Saints. He was special. I put special in all caps in my notes in 2019. He had 150 catches, over 1,700 yards, 9 touchdowns. He was Offensive Player of the Year. He was an All Pro, Pro Bowler, maybe the best receiver in the league that season, statistically and otherwise. He finishes the year obviously wide receiver one with those numbers. He finishes seventh overall in fantasy points. The next year, actually, I should say that he was being drafted around fifth overall, and that's some very special company. Teams, guys were spending around $55 on him, and the next year he just has a really really strange season in 2020. He uh, gets hurt in week one. He has a high ankle sprain, misses several games, gets suspended because he gets in a fight during practice with CJ Gardner Johnson. He comes back in like week nine. He plays. He's okay. He does all right, and then he ends up going on IR for like 2 weeks, which was very strange again. And he comes back in the wild card game, and that was in the wild card game. He scores his first touchdown of the season. So in 7 games, he has 40 catches for 438 yards, which is not bad if you divide that up. It's not great, but it's okay. And again, no touchdowns, which was the big thing. And it was a weird combination of the injury and also him being kind of a shithead because he got into that fight. And I'm sure it caused him a lot of issues. But the funny thing is, like, it must have been a much worse injury than reported because he missed all of 2021 with the ankle injury. And last year, 22, he plays just 3 games. And now he's 30 years old. He's looking good. I mean, I'm seeing clips. I'm obviously following the Saints a little bit closer now because my guy Derek Carr is there. But I'm seeing highlights in training camp. He's making catches. I think he played in the last preseason game. I may not be mistaken there, but he looks healthy now. But it was just a incredible fall off for a guy that looked like he was going to be the next great receiver in the NFL.
Yeah, 100%, man. It was just shocking to see him miss so many games over the last 2 seasons. Especially when they're like, "Oh, it was just a high ankle sprain," and then he misses 2021. He misses most of 2022. So hopefully he gets back out there and is somewhat productive. But obviously, he's never going to be that top dog wide receiver that he was heading into 2020. But hopefully we see a nice little bounce back from Michael Thomas here this year.
Yeah, it's very weird. Like you said, it wasn't normally you expect if a guy misses that kind of time, it's a ACL, it's a Achilles, it's a some kind of broken bone, whatever. But he never had like a serious enough injury for it to be you know fully diagnosed in him. So it was just strange. And I remember especially last year, it seemed like he was going to keep coming back. They kept pushing it, pushing it. I remember stashing him on my IR in a couple leagues, like thinking, "Oh yeah, this is going to be great. He's going to come back at the end of the season. He's going to do really well." Obviously, he does not. And now he's probably wide receiver two with Chris Olave there, so he gets a little bit of pressure taken off of him. Maybe he's able to find some of that old form. But yeah, that's it for our picks. I mean, we'd love to hear some of your fantasy stories, some guys that you bet the house on, some guys that you took first or second overall. Maybe last year. I mean, if we were doing it for last year, it's probably Jonathan Taylor who's the biggest bust.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, 100%,
but
100%.
well,
And I made the mistake of going all in on him.
yeah, I picked McCaffrey pretty high in a couple leagues, and I thought that things were going to go bad, and obviously it worked out because he ends up in a better
Give me a
situation.
name for this year, Khaled. Give me a name for this year. Who do you think
For
will be a
a
bust this year?
bust, I mean,
Yeah,
who's top five? We're talking about Justin Jefferson. I don't know who else. There's no really running backs,
Jamar
right? Going
Chase.
Jamar
Yeah,
Chase, Travis
I mean
Kelsey.
Taylor's going up there in the top 5, 6 picks. Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard's going up there. Christian McCaffrey's going up there.
Yeah, CMC. Bijan
Um,
Robinson, right? He's getting top 10 buzz.
Bijan Robinson. Yeah, I think that's my pick, Colin. Bijan
Bijan
Robinson.
Robinson.
I don't think that's my pick for this year,
Explain
but we'll see.
why. Just give me
Uh,
30
I,
seconds.
I I just I just don't. Okay, all right, 30 seconds. I just don't like his situation. Right, he's got Desmond Ritter as his quarterback. That's a pretty poor situation. Uh, the Atlanta line doesn't look great. He's likely in a timeshare with Tyler Algier, Cordero Patterson. So a lot of factors going against him. Talent wise, yeah, dude's supreme. But if you're banking on him this year to give you production, I think you're going to be sorely disappointed. Definitely a dynasty guy, long term value for sure. But
Mhm.
this year, stay away from him. He's not going to be good.
I'm I don't know if I agree
Not
with
not
that.
not if you're picking him in the top 10, I you're going to get burned.
Sure, sure. I can see that. I think he'll do really well. I mean, this offense is geared for that. Obviously, he is in that timeshare, like you said, with Algier and Cordero Patterson, but he's like a top 5 pick, so or whatever he was. So he's going to get a ton of carries, ton of touches. These days, teams are like, we're going to burn this dude out in the first few seasons while we still have him on his rookie deal. And I think the Falcons probably run the ball more than anybody else, and they have a more run focused offense than most other teams. So I think he'll be good. My pick is going to be Jamar Chase for a potential bust. I think
Jamar
Joe.
Chase, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's more to do with Joe Burrow. He's already hurt. I think he's going to miss a few games. I honestly don't know who their backup quarterback is. Uh,
I don't either.
we should probably look that up and see if he's somebody decent. Maybe you could look it up while I'm talking here. But that's my pick. I mean, Joe Burrow had that weird calf injury. I think it was like he got carted off. You don't usually get carted off for a calf strain. So that's my main concern. I don't think it has anything to do with his talent. I mean, I think we've talked a few times. You know, there's been a few guys on this list where it wasn't really a talent issue; it was just a quarterback issue. I mean, Juju, Brandon Marshall, Jordan Nelson, whatever. I mean, obviously Jamar Chase is head and shoulders above all these guys, but I think it's just more about Joe Burrow and the quarterback situation.
Yep, and Joe Burrow's backup is apparently Trevor Simeon. So
It's not
good
great.
luck to Jamar Chase if Joe Burrow doesn't come back.
It's not
So
the
yep,
worst, you
I like
know.
it.
It's not a rookie. At least he has a veteran guy that has started some games. But yeah, that's a high-powered offense. Regardless, you know, he's got a lot of weapons around him. But yeah, not ideal. So I think it'll be relative to expectations similar. I don't think he's going to be like 400 yards or whatever. But I don't think he's going to be worthy of a top 5 pick.
All right. All right. We
Yeah.
shall find out.
And we'll do plenty more of these. This is a lot of fun. I love talking fantasy football. We should do like fantasy gems, guys that you picked up in like week 7 that won you
Let's
Super
do it.
Bowl. I'm talking like Sam Gatto at some point, if you even remember that name. Uh,
Wow.
that's a
gem.
throwback, right?
That's a real gem, Colin. That's a real gem, Colin. That's a real gem. Yeah.
Yeah, we appreciate you guys
We'll do it.
listening. Yeah, make sure to leave us a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. Make sure to follow us on all the major social media platforms. Again, we're on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, TikTok at 4040 Vision Pod. Got our podcast content, plenty of other short form videos and cool what ifs and stuff like that on those platforms. So thank you guys again. Thanks, Sulman. Appreciate you, man.